Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our LinkedIn Live series, Expect the Unexpected. And today, we're going to be talking about diversity in AI governance and how it's entering the boardroom. I'm joined today with Vanessa Coelho. Welcome, Vanessa. She is Chief Innovation Officer at Citi, Head of Citi Ventures, and Head of Citi Productivity. It's a great pleasure to talk with you again and to spend some time talking about diversity in AI governance and what that impact is to the boardroom. So welcome.
Thanks, Scott, for the invitation. Great to see you again.
So Vanessa, one of the things that really strikes me when I think about diversity in AI and I think about model governance is the fact that, we did a survey recently with Corinium Global, and in that survey, it basically emphasized that about 65% of analytic executives couldn't explain what's happening in their models, let alone, expecting board members to understand the technology that they're using to make decisions. So I wanted to get your opinion around, what does that mean for the work we need to do to enable boards to better understand AI? And then also, what does it mean for innovation, which is so critical to the roles that you play?
A great question, Scott. I think there's such a gap right now between practitioners in AI and consumers of AI, if you will. Many of us are consumers of AI every day in our daily lives, and we don't have the technical acumen that practitioners bring to understand how to query those models, how to really get into the guts of, are they biased, are they not biased, and how do you make sure of that? So I think there's work to be done to ensure that, whether it's executives or board members, we're preparing folks for the kinds of questions that they need to ask. Because of course, no one who's sitting in a boardroom has the time to become a deep expert in building models. But we need to make sure that we have, the set of questions and the way to query these models so that executives and board members can get comfortable with governance around the models that are being employed. And I think, this is true, frankly, of any new technology. It's not unique to AI, but it's critical in AI since so many of these models will underpin how technology shapes our lives going forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I think just writing it down and having a standard that's applied across an organization, right, that you can work towards and then enforce and then improve, right, is the first steps. And I know in speaking with different organizations, my experience has been is that very few have it written down, and let alone are they enforcing it as a standard. And I think that's a necessary step. It's always part of this sort of concept that I have that it's time for AI to grow up, and we've seen AI be such a powerful tool, right? But as you mentioned, right, getting to prime time and using it as a technology that has both tremendous rewards but risks also, and recognizing that and putting the guardrails around it is tremendously important.
Yeah, I just underscore something you said, Scott, which is, it's okay for executives or board members to have a cheat sheet around AI, right? If you think about, there's such experts in whatever industry they're overseeing that they sort of have in the back of their mind the 10 questions to ask about a new business or a new client segment or a new business model. But they don't necessarily have those 10 standard questions to ask when they're thinking about AI. And so, I'd encourage people, to your point, to write those things down, to share them so that, it's not bad to ask, right? No one was born knowing about all of these things. And we need to make sure that as leaders, we're constantly modeling the fact that knowing how to ask those right questions is really the key.
Yeah, no, excellent. No, I agree. And finding that analytic leader that will take that on and writing that down and starting the journey, I think is tremendously important. The other question I have is, going beyond the boardroom, right? Obviously, the board needs to understand the AI and the risks associated with it and the governance. But, I'm always intrigued with, really large organizations such as yours that, has over 200,000 employees, all trying to focus on, how to drive innovation and, how to make sure that we have diversity and governance around ensuring that we're taking in the diversity of thought and opinion and lack of bias. So I was just curious, how does that get implemented in such a large organization such as Citi with respect to a set of standards for how employees themselves will operate under some level of governance and standard for employing diversity in their work?
Yeah, it's a really important point and question. I think at Citi we think that culture is the backbone of innovation, right? And part of culture is not just how you behave, but who you've invited to the table and what kind of voice they have. So we really start with, who are we attracting and retaining as employees? We've run a program at Citi for many years now called Cupid. And Cupid was a program that said, we need the next generation of leaders in our industry to come from diverse backgrounds, to have diverse perspectives, expertise, and to be diverse in terms of race and gender, ethnicity, and so on. And I think that's really important. There's so many anecdotes about why it is that as you're building models, you need people with different perspectives around the table, not the least of which just to understand what data sets need to get fed into these models so that as the machines learn, they're learning in an unbiased fashion. And that has to start with the people that you invite around the table and the opportunity that you give them to have a voice around how things get built. At Citi, we think this is critically important because models will get built, and then because of the very nature of machine learning, they get embedded into business processes. And once they get embedded into business processes, just kind of run in the background, right? And so you want to make sure that on the front end of building those models, you've got those diverse voices around the table so that you don't inadvertently put something into production that somehow hasn't, got the right guardrails to make sure that what's coming out of that model is indeed unbiased. And we have many examples of this, but I think this is not just about facial recognition, which is the example that gets cited so often. It's about, in our case, things like underwriting. How do we ensure that the models that we're building are unbiased, are fair, and continue to be so as those models learn? So a lot of work to do, to your point, as AI grows up.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you mentioned is really important is the fact that these AI and machine learning models get embedded, and in some sense, right, they can propagate sort of mistakes or bias or traditional thought, and we see that in the data moving forward. And I actually did a talk for interns at FICO yesterday, and it was really interesting to see how attuned they are to these issues of diversity and how front of mind it is. And I think there's a lot to be said for what you're doing at Citi to challenge the conventional thought, right? Because I think too often, when we have success with AI and machine learning and we've embedded in a business process, there's a resistance to change, and there's also just blinders that we all have as we celebrate successes, but not necessarily look at things very critically. So I love it. I think it's really important because I think a lot of bias and challenges are not due to malice necessarily, but maybe lack of awareness, and that's really, really important.
Yeah, I agree. I think very few people in the world intend to do harm, but that doesn't mean that mistakes, as you point out, can't creep in. So having that governance built in and really making sure that you're explicitly thinking about unbiased models and then setting standards and guidelines for how to create those, we think is important. Actually, as part of our $1 billion plus commitment to racial equity at Citi, we've started a team called READY, which is all about racial equity in data and design, because a lot of people talk about the data going into models, but oftentimes the people building models are quite separated from user experience designers and people who are thinking about kind of the consumers of the output of those models later on. And so we're very interested in bringing those fields closer together and understanding how we can leverage the expertise in user experience design and thinking about what kinds of data might better inform a model with the folks who are actually building the models, and thinking about, as we bring those guidelines together, is that a way to strengthen the ability to create unbiased models?
Yeah, no, that's ideal. And I think writing that down and asking those questions, and at least, having that conscious sort of, check marks around, challenging that in the design. And you're right, it's really about design. Too often we jump at, applying an algorithm to data, and we all talk about data as being, a huge, important part of a machine learning process, but we usually talk about data cleaning and data processing. We don't think about, design, and in some sense, that's the most critical part of it, because making the wrong decisions up front means that we're going to spend all this time building a model, but potentially with data that, we didn't select the right types of data. We didn't ask for the data in ways that we got the best sort of clarity of what this data is. And, more and more I get concerned about even outcome data, right? Where, what is the quality of the tag? And we spend time refining algorithms to get a little bit of lift potentially, where we could get much, much larger sort of returns by just looking very critically at how we're interacting with our customers and getting that data. So I think it's incredibly important to focus on design and challenge that convention, particularly in these days, and of focus on responsible AI and ethics. So I agree completely. Taking another direction here, I think one of the things, we talk very often, and I spend a lot of time thinking about models that, improve credit risk or fraud decisions or detect AML, right? And embedding them into business software. But a big part of what I believe you're focused on is a concept called artificial enlightenment. And I wanted to just allow you to talk and share that concept, because I think it's really, really powerful, and it's related to this concept of bias and blinders, if you will, and awareness. So can you tell us a little bit more about artificial enlightenment and the role of AI and maybe making all of us a little bit smarter than we would be otherwise?
Sure. So, if I go back to really Mesopotamia and, mathematical tools and why they were created, in many ways they were created because there were too many data points in the world for humans to keep track of. And so a lot of mathematics at its core is about simplifying, summarizing, synthesizing, right? Making something that's very complex easier for humans to take in. And so you've got literally thousands of years of tool development up and through a lot of computational development that was about making things, from lots and lots of data points to something easier to absorb. And then, of course, there are lots of tools that help you understand the underlying data set. So, you might know what the average is, but that doesn't help you very much if you don't also know the standard deviation. And the standard deviation, in many ways, is just a way to give you a clue as to what the underlying data points were that went into that equation. What's interesting about AI, particularly this last sort of 5 years of kind of resurgence of the AI summer, I guess you'd call it, is we've now got computational tools, whether you think about the ability to ingest data, to store data, to put it in the cloud, to manipulate it, that allow us to think about individual data points rather than synthesizing things. And this, I think, is really important because actually humans are fairly poor at making decisions around aggregated data. So a simple example, right? We all talk a lot about the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is an important thing to understand. But what's really important is whether you have a job that allows you to provide for your family. The unemployment rate is simply an aggregation of all the bits of data around, is this person employed and is that person employed? And so I think, when we talk about artificial enlightenment, we talk about taking the same tools that underpin AI around data creation, data manipulation, the ability to store, the ability to derive insight. And instead of trying to mimic human intelligence through AI, trying to augment human intelligence. So presenting those data points back to people in a way that they can look at, absorb, and hopefully make more effective decisions. So one really easy example of that, if you take the unemployment rate, is a platform we launched called Worthy. And Worthy is all about skills, right? People talk about upskilling and reskilling and the importance of that. But not everyone needs to go become a computer scientist. Not everyone needs to go and learn Python, right? That might be a skill that for some people really helps them to launch a new career or earn more money. But for others, it might not make a difference at all because it's actually very individualistic. So the average doesn't help. With Worthy, you can go in and you can use a platform that feeds on a lot of data, that presents a lot of data to you, but in a way that you can make an effective decision for yourself. And so to us, it's not about AI versus AE. It's about how do we not only use these tools to mimic human decision making, but also use those tools at the same time to augment human decision making.
I really like the concept, and I think it's really important, right? Because one of the things that I get challenged with when I think about, where we're headed and the complexity of the world ahead of us and data. I mean, I think it boggles my mind, right, to try to consider all the data that we work with. And you can imagine average people that are focused on trying to make really good decisions, right, and important decisions about, you mentioned unemployment, and maybe their financial health and other sort of decisions that are really important, and not having necessarily all the tools ahead of them or a way to simulate or understand the impact of a decision, and to play that out and to share that insight and say, this is the likelihood of a better outcome, or this is maybe not a good use of one's time. I think really it kind of gets to the promise of some of the AI and machine learning that we want to see, right? We want to see it to supplement and improve, the human experience, and make us a little bit more superhuman ourselves by, making the better decisions up front. And I did a talk with Gary Kasparov around, chess, right? And, the best sort of chess is, not necessarily the human master, and it's not the ML or the AI master. It's the combination of the two. And I think, the work you're doing there is really important, because it's kind of personalizing that analytics. It's the model for one. And I think that's a really great concept. It's really important. And in some sense, we have a responsibility to ensure that we are doing that for those that we serve.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the last 18 months around the world, certainly this kind of work was really important, because in many ways, it is less relevant for an individual what the COVID rate is in their nation or in their state. It's really relevant what's the chance of me encountering someone who might be sick on the way to the grocery store. And so if we can use these tools to break down information and present it to people in ways that they can make those decisions, that combination that you talked about of person plus AI, I think yields the benefit of the tools that we have and the benefit of tens of thousands of years of evolution and decision making that we all carry around in our heads.
Yeah, no, agreed. And one of the things that came to mind when I first heard about this was even our ability as analysts maybe to working cases to not to challenge ourselves in terms of in either unconscious bias even, right? Imagine working cases where you're extending loans and you're making decisions about outcomes, and just present people with information that challenges you and allows you to grow in your ability to kind of look at it holistically. I mean, in a very crude way, right? And when you get an electrical bill and you show that you're using 2 times as much power as all your neighbors, right? You could sit there and scratch and you think about that, right? But in terms of things where we're impacting individuals, right, and ultimately the human beings, right, who are making decisions and running businesses are impacting others, and challenge that and being able to say, listen, look at the data a little bit different way, right, or maybe challenge some of your assumptions around how you're working, let's say a fraud case or originations situation. I think is also super powerful to get some level of consistency, but also to allow us to grow, right, in our ability to understand the world around us. So it's wonderful. So I look at this and I think about the fact that we want to really impact and improve the human experience and enlightenment, and I think that's really important. But it comes again, kind of circles back to okay, the AI that we're going to use, and maybe some of it will be nuggets of information to inform a decision-making process. But we still have these AI models that we want to have some sort of guidance around. What are the things that we should be doing to ensure that they're built kind of in a responsible way? So what's your thoughts about, what are some concrete steps that organizations can take today as they come back to the standards that we talked about earlier around things that they can start to at least put place markers down around developing a strategy around? So what would your thoughts be around that?
Yeah, Scott, I mean, I think first and foremost, it comes back to something we talked about a moment ago, which is make sure you have the right people around the table. Not all of those people need to be data analysts, right? Bring a business person in, bring a compliance person in, bring someone in who might ask, what seem to be naive questions, but just to put things on the table, right? Bring people with different perspectives into the front end of building models. Second, I think you mentioned earlier, make sure that you then know what questions to ask. And third, I think something that you've been working on that I think you should share with folks is how do we standardize this? How do we take making unbiased models in AI out of just the good intentions of every individual analyst, and make it something that is a must do. If I think about a comparison, right? The ADA has, guidelines for, what do websites, what do mobile sites need to look like? How do they need to behave in order to ensure inclusion? And I think if we can get to that same kind of point in AI, we will really push the field forward in terms of, everyone's ability to equitably enjoy the results.
No, agreed. Right, the right audience is super important, and coming to this concept of the standards right around this, I think it's really important, and you're right. I've been talking about it for a while now, and I'm really passionate about it. Is this concept of the fact that we need to establish a standard for each and every organization. It needs to be kind of shared with the board and understood. It needs to be refined and improved because nothing's perfect from day one. But then it has to be enforced, right? And I think everybody's trying to do the right things, and with respect to development of models, and very very rarely, to your point, are people malicious in that. But without the frameworks around them, right, to guide to a standard and to ensure they built to a standard, it's really really hard. And I think one of the things that I've driven recently is to take model development processes and drive more of that decision making and standards into the model development process itself. So, for example, right, you would have a blockchain, and that blockchain would persist. Who are the scientists working on it? What's the problem definition? What are the acceptable technologies per company standards? Attest to what those look like throughout the model development process, and then demonstrating just very concretely what steps were taken to answer the data assessments from an ethics and bias perspective, who signed off on it. And I think there's something very, important to that, because as soon as you start to enforce, right, it becomes really real. And, it feels a bit like a burden, but it's not, right? It allows everyone to ensure that there's a standard of model development that's applied across the organization, that the data scientists can feel comfortable that the work that they're doing is not impacting people in an adverse way inadvertently, and they've had these controls and protections in place. And some of the things I've heard from data scientists as I talk to practitioners that are building the models is that they feel incredible pressure, right, to build models and build them ethically and responsibly. And it's a tremendously complex environment, and we do definitely owe that to our scientists and to our organizations to codify that and to enforce it. And more importantly than that, is also to monitor it over time, right? Which is another interesting statistic from that Cornell Global report that we did, that very very few organizations actually monitor their models in production, let alone for bias and ethics issues. And so this codification and this standard that is enforced, I think, drives accountability. It also drives a level of quality that we need to get to, like every other business process that we use within most of our enterprises today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that standardization then allows for data scientists to have much better pattern recognition when something is out of guidelines or out of the norm. And if everyone's sort of going at it in their own way, it's really difficult to develop that pattern recognition across a shared community. So I think the more we can get to that, both within individual organizations and even across organizations, the further we'll be to making sure that eliminating bias in AI isn't just dependent on individuals, but that the entire sort of practice of it gets lifted up.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to end our conversation on, Vanessa. I really appreciate the conversation and being part of this dialogue around how we drive more accountability and governance of AI in the boardrooms. I love the work that you're doing at Citi and this concept of artificial enlightenment. And so thank you for sharing that with me and everyone that's listening in today.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. It's always great to see you and to chat. And I think the work also that you're doing at FICO around governance and how do we build in these standards is something that we can all learn from. So appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.